Then let's generate our motivation. And it may be a beautiful day today with the sun shining and reflecting off the snow and very lovely blue sky. So we may think, oh, everything's very nice. And completely neglect to realize the situation that we're in, which is, if we look closely, we'll see we are bound by afflictions and karma and forced to take one rebirth after another in samsara due to the afflictions and karma in our own mind streams. And so while today it may be beautiful outside, that is not and has not always been our circumstance in samsara. There are multiple realms of existence and many different types of beings that we've been born as, according to the karma that we've created. And due to our destructive actions in the past, we've been born also in very unfortunate realms with a lot of suffering, and also in very blissful realms. But none of them have brought any kind of stable peace or security, as we're just bombarded with experiences due to afflictions and karma. So it's important that we generate the aspiration to be free from this situation and not be sucked in and deceived by the pleasantness that seems to be going on around us. But realize that there's a fundamental flaw in our situation. And so therefore, seeking liberation from this flaw of this multitude of flaws of cyclic existence or samsara, and seeking a state of actual peace that doesn't disappear, and that doesn't involve harm to self or harm to others. But just aspiring for our own liberation really isn't sufficient, because our whole lives depend on the kindness of other living beings. So doing our spiritual practice for our own welfare alone, when our whole life depends on the kindness of others, doesn't seem right, does it? Whereas if we're able to develop our spiritual qualities, even to the point of becoming fully awakened Buddhas ourselves, then we'll have the complete set of inner qualities and outer tools to be best able to benefit others by also showing them the way to liberation and awakening. So with this strong feeling that we want ourselves and others to be free of cyclic existence, and with a mind that sees through all the deceptive-looking pleasures of cyclic existence, let's turn our mind to developing the qualities of an awakened Buddha. for the benefit of self and others. And let that be our motivation for sharing the Dharma in the upcoming days, as well as in our whole lives. So this is the third year that we're doing teachings on Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. And this book was, how to say, it's involved with the project I'm working on now for, the Library of Wisdom and Compassion and those books that I'm co-authoring with His Holiness. And it originated way back in the 90s when I made a request to His Holiness for to write a short text that perhaps Geshes, excuse me, that perhaps Geshes could use when they taught Westerners. And His Holiness turned around and said, well, let's do a bigger thing first, and then we'll do the smaller one. So, and he gave me materials to start working on his Lamrim teachings. And then over the years, I had a series of interviews and was able to ask questions and so on. And in one of those interviews, he said, this project has to be unique. And so he said, we've got to put materials in it from the other Buddhist traditions, because he said that he has many more interfaith dialogues with people of other religions, and knows more of them, and knows them better than he does other Buddhists from different other traditions. And so he really wanted to try and bring the Buddhist community more together by helping people of the different traditions learn about each other. And so, not learn about each other the way that is often done, where, a Thai temple looks like this and a Tibetan temple looks like this, and this is how they dress in China, and this is how they dress in Burma. But really looking at the teachings so that people could see how similar the teachings were in the various traditions, and also their unique differences. Yeah. Because he never tries to brush over the differences. He feels very strongly, also when he does interfaith dialogue with Christians and Muslims and so forth, that to get along, it isn't necessary that we all believe the same thing. Yeah, he says, there are differences, but we can still respect each other, even though we may have different views about different things. And so it was with that spirit, showing the commonalities as well as the differences in the Buddhist traditions, that this book got extracted from the bigger project and became the first book that was published as a separate volume, different from the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. And so, the teachings, the Tibetan teachings, we use the term Sanskrit tradition and Pali tradition, not so much Mahayana and Tibetan and Theravada, and Hinayana is banned from vocabulary. It's a horrible, deprecating term. We should never use it. And instead talk about the Pali tradition, Sanskrit tradition, as two broad general categories, the Pali tradition being the traditions that use the Pali language as their canonical language. And so that would be in Sri Lanka, some areas of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, some areas in Malaysia, some areas in Indonesia, where else? That whole Southeast and South Asia there. And it's also spread to the West and also to Africa. And, different Dharma centers growing in different places. And then the Sanskrit tradition being the one that uses Sanskrit as its canonical language. And so that tradition started out, that was more in North India, and then went into Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and then from there into China, and then also to China by the sea route, going around through the Straits of Malacca, and then up around to the east coast of China. And then from China going to Korea, to Japan, and then later the teachings arrived in Tibet, some of them coming over the Himalayas from India and some from China, although the Tibetans chose mostly to go with the lineage from India directly. Yeah. And so, many people think, put it this way. The Buddha in both the Pali and Sanskrit tradition, he talked about three vehicles of practitioners. The Shravaka, or hearers, the solitary realizers, or Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. Okay? And what's interesting, what I discovered in this research, because I did most of the research on the Pali tradition and also the Chinese tradition, is that there's a bodhisattva vehicle and, of course, a hearer and solitary realizer vehicle in both the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition. Yeah, the Sanskrit tradition emphasizes more the bodhisattva vehicle, but somebody can practice it and become a Shravaka Arhat. And the Pali tradition may emphasize the Shravaka vehicle more. Nowadays, there aren't really many Pratyeka Buddhas, many solitary realizers, because the Buddhist teachings are in the world, and solitary realizers only come about when they're not. So the Pali tradition may emphasize the Shravaka tradition or hearer tradition more, but there is also a bodhisattva vehicle taught there. And so this will really come out in the section that we're giving. In the 2 previous years, we covered other topics, so I just want to review what they are so that you have a sense of where we're coming in right now. Okay? So we started out in the book, and if you have missed the first 2 courses, it might be good to reread or read to start with, and other people reread the material that's already been covered or watch the videos of that. So we started off looking at the origin and the spread of the Buddha's doctrine, so the Buddha's life, the different canons, how the Dharma spread to different countries, and then a little bit about the history of the Pali tradition, and how it's how it developed in Southeast Asia, because they talk about Sangha Rajas, and who are they, and what do they mean, and so on. Buddhism in China, where Buddhism went there early on, and really flourished. And the Chinese canon is actually the largest. It's larger than the Pali canon, and it's larger than the Tibetan too, in terms of sutras and so on. And then, of course, Buddhism going to Tibet, which happened later. It started going to China in 1st and 2nd century BC. It went to Sri Lanka in 3rd century BC. It didn't go to Tibet until 6th century AD, so quite a bit later. And Buddhism had developed in India by that time, so there were different commentaries and somewhat different scriptures too that went to Tibet, because what went were the ones that were prominent in India at that time. Yeah. Okay, and so then the 2nd chapter was talking about refuge, because refuge is what makes us a Buddhist. It's the, what they say is the demarcation of becoming a Buddhist, is taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And so what in the world does that mean? First of all, do the 3 jewels exist? So we talk about that, and Nagarjuna gave this absolutely wonderful proof of the existence of the 3 jewels. So that comes in the book. And then discussion of the Tathagata's qualities, and the Tathagata meaning the Buddha, and what are those qualities according to the Pali tradition, what are they according to the Tibetan, to the Sanskrit tradition. And here we really see a lot of similarities, then a discussion, of what the Dharma is. And here I think the Sanskrit tradition develops more with the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, exactly what the Dharma refuge is, the true cessations and true paths. And then the Sangha refuge, the Sangha jewel. Here we see some difference, although there's overlap too. In the Pali tradition, they talk about the 4 pairs of Aryas. So the stream enterers, once returners, non-returners, and arhats. And in the Sanskrit tradition, they talk about those same 4, but they emphasize more the bodhisattvas and becoming fully awakened Buddhas. And then there's some discussion about the Buddhas, who was the Buddha, because the traditions have different ways of seeing the historical Buddha. And was he omniscient, or did he have all knowledge? What did he did his mental continuum cease at the time of parinirvana when he died? As many of the, but not all of the Pali followers, say, or, are there the 4 kayas of the Buddha, and the continuity of the Buddha's mind stream still exists, as the Sanskrit tradition holds. So some discussion of that. From there we go into the discussion of the 4 Noble Truths, or actually calling, I think 4 Noble Truths isn't a very good translation, because it's actually the 4 truths of the Aryas, and the Aryas were translated as noble beings because they've realized reality directly. But to say the 4 Noble Truths, and then your first one is suffering, which is also a bad translation, then people think, what is noble about suffering? Yeah. So I just used to, usually say the 4 truths, sometimes the 4 truths of Aryas. Again, Aryas being the ones who have realized reality directly. And then, talk about, so the first one, I will not use the term suffering, because I think that is a misleading term. And I'll stick with the Pali and Sanskrit term dukkha, So yes, I know it's another new foreign word, but we learn Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, Guru, Karma, Nirvana. Certainly we can learn another one word. Yeah, and hopefully they won't make a perfume out of it like they did with Nirvana, Okay. And samsara, yeah, both of them, samsara and nirvana, became perfumes. So dukkha, means like unsatisfactory. So it includes what we normally call suffering, physical and mental suffering, but it includes much more than that. Yeah. So it includes just the unsatisfactory nature of even the happiness we have in samsara, because we have happiness in samsara, but does it last? Yeah, if it lasted, we wouldn't be here. Yeah, we would be enjoying whatever it was that was our lasting happiness. Yeah, and we wouldn't be seeking something else. So, even the temporal sense pleasure happiness doesn't last. And that leaves us feeling restless, discontent, and a certain level of insecurity. Yeah. And then just the whole situation of having a body and mind that are not free, that are under the control of afflictions and karma. That's not a particularly good situation. We think that we are free. We live in a free country, which nowadays means that you are free to own guns and, shoot at whoever you want to and hope you don't get caught. And, it means you can drive to any shopping center you want to or go online anytime you want to and buy whatever you want. Yeah, but is that real freedom? We have freedom to, you can tweet whatever you want nowadays, you're free. But, that's not the real meaning of freedom, is it? Because doing all those things certainly doesn't bring us lasting peace and internal happiness. So freedom, from a spiritual viewpoint, talks about making your mind free from ignorance, other afflictions like attachment, anger, and so forth. The influence of polluted karma, that's karma created under the influence of ignorance. And then, of course, just the whole situation of being controlled by those and taking one rebirth after the next without much, any control. Because, it isn't like we die and then we sit up on a cloud and we look down and we, are so happy and we say, now who am I going to choose as my parents for the next life? Put your applications in here. That's not how it works. Rather, our mind is just pushed by the force of the ignorance and karma, and it grasps, it desperately wants another life in samsara. And so they say, be careful what you want, you might get it, and this is it. We get another life in samsara. We happen to have a very good one, the optimum one now for practicing the Dharma. But you just look around and, for most living beings, their life is much more difficult than ours, not only in a material way, but especially in terms of not having access to teachers and teachings and the opportunity to practice and so on. Okay. And then, so that's we have the true dukkha, we have the causes of dukkha being ignorance and afflictions and polluted karma. And then the last two truths, true cessation and true paths, they're actually the Dharma refuge. So true paths refers to a consciousness that is informed by the realization of reality or emptiness, and that brings about the true cessations, which are the cessations of the different levels of afflictions and other defilements that cover our mind. And so the path is very much about removing, practicing the path, attaining the true cessations in order to free ourselves from dukkha and its causes. And so in talking about true paths, what we need to practice, one system of describing them that is common to both the Pali and Sanskrit tradition is talking about the three higher trainings. So the higher training in ethical conduct, in concentration, and in wisdom. Okay, and so then there's a nice chapter about ethical conduct. Yeah, in the Pali tradition, they emphasize this a lot. Chinese tradition also. Tibetans, they have it, but it's not emphasized as much. And I think it would benefit the tradition more to emphasize it more. Okay, so His Holiness starts out talking about the importance of ethical conduct and then the different kinds of pratimoksha ethical restraints. Pratimoksha, according to the Tibetans, translates as individual liberation. So they're the first set of precepts that we take, and there's 8 kinds of them. Yeah, so you have the upasaka and upasika, which some of you have taken the 5 lay precepts. So you're upasakas or upasikas now. Then there's the 8 one-day vows. Then there's the 2 novice vows for men and women, so shramaneri, shramanera. There's an ordination called shikshamana, which is a training ordination for nuns. And then the 7th and 8th one are the full ordination for men and women, so bhikshu and bhikshuni. So it talks about that. And since the monastic precepts involve celibacy, there's a whole section talking about why the precepts involve celibacy, which is a big discussion in society now, like with the Catholic Church and what's been going on there and so on. Yeah, then it talks about the different Vinaya schools. We talk about monastics, priests, lay teachers, the purpose of monastic life, Tibetan monastics and monastic institutions, because in old Tibet, a quarter of the male population was monks, so that influenced how Tibet functioned as a country and how they were able to live as monastics. Then challenges for Western monastics, bringing, the ordination and the monastic way of life to the West. And then full ordination for women, which is a topic in all the traditions now, because the ordination lineage for women died out in the Pali tradition and also in Tibetan Buddhism, but it still exists in the Chinese tradition and the Korean tradition. So big discussion about that. His Holiness gives some advice for monastics, and then there's a poem where he shares his joy of monastic discipline, and then talking about the other kinds of ethical restraints that we practice in the Sanskrit tradition, the Bodhisattva ethical restraints and the Tantric ethical restraints. Then going into concentration. So this is all what we talked about before, the importance of concentration, the realms of existence that people take rebirth in versus the spheres of consciousness. Because when you develop deep states of concentration, then your body can be a human body but the plane of existence of your mind when you go into meditative concentration becomes from the form realm or formless realms. Okay? And then talking about how concentration is developed, the 5 hindrances, the 5 absorption factors, the different kinds of concentrations, the ones in the form realm, the formless realms, the 8 meditative liberations, some of the super knowledges or psychic powers or supernormal abilities we can develop through concentration. Okay, and then the Sanskrit explanation of the 5 faults and 8 antidotes and the 9 stages of sustained attention and so on. Okay, so quite a bit about concentration. So that was the second of the 3 higher trainings. Then we talked about the 3rd higher training, the higher training in wisdom. And so began with discussing the 37 aids to awakening, which are emphasized in the Pali tradition. The Sanskrit tradition has them as well. And during our interviews, His Holiness expressed a wish that they were practiced more by people in the Tibetan tradition. With the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So some of our winter retreats have been on this, mindfulness of the body, of feelings, of mind, and of phenomena. And so it's a very rich practice to really understand how our present body and mind function, especially before taking tantric initiation, where you practice a different kind of mindfulness of body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. Okay, and then others of the 37 aids to awakening, the 4 supreme strivings, the 4 bases of supernormal powers, 5 faculties, 5 powers, 7 awakening factors, and the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, and then going into the conventional and ultimate natures of these 37 aids to awakening, because in the Sanskrit tradition, you always, whatever you're practicing, you always bring in the perspective of emptiness. And so chapter 7 goes into talking more about, selflessness and emptiness. What are they? How do you realize them? And this is the section that I found very, very intriguing when I started reading many of passages from the Pali scriptures. And I found that if I read them with a certain view, I could tell that Nagarjuna had read them and some of his teachings had come from reading them, and then also seeing how they could be read very much with the philosophical viewpoint of the Madhyamikas. Yeah. So I found that quite fascinating, and finding, different passages, because, again, that one of the reasons for writing this book was to overcome misconceptions that the different traditions have about each other. And so one of the big misconceptions is what they see as the nature of reality, and all sorts of other misconceptions. But so this section I found very interesting. And then talking about dependent arising, and how it's seen in the 2 traditions, beginning with the 12 links of dependent origination that talk about how we are born in samsara and how we free ourselves from samsara, and then going into, who circles in samsara. And then in the Sanskrit tradition, the different levels of dependent arising, causal dependence, mutual dependence, dependent designation, and then talking about how dependent arising and emptiness are compatible, and then a little bit from the Pali tradition about terms, concepts, and conventions, because, they also talk about things being just conventions and not to grab onto conventions and solidify them and so forth. Then there were chapters about, and this was last year, we did this, serenity and insight, so how to develop the serenity as a form of concentration, and then the insight into the nature of reality. Okay, and then how one progresses on the path, the different stages of the path, as one deepens serenity and insight, and then unifies serenity and insight. And so here there's a difference. There's some similarities in the layout of the path, but there's there's differences in terminology, and so on. And so, for example, seeing the aggregates as being free, meditating on selflessness, put it this way, meditating on selflessness. In the Sanskrit tradition, we see this as meditation on emptiness that is leading, to, higher states on the path, and that the empty, you're developing a supramundane wisdom. In the Pali tradition, it's not, that wisdom is not called a supramundane wisdom, because you're focusing on the aggregates, and the aggregates are polluted samsaric things. Yeah, so they don't call the meditation on selflessness as the thing that is bringing actual nirvana. It's one step on the path, but then they say you break through after you realize impermanence and the nature of dukkha for all compounded things under the influence of afflictions and karma, and you realize selflessness, then you break through after that and realize nirvana directly. And that wisdom is a supramundane wisdom, a transcendental wisdom. Yeah, so it's a little bit different how they see the path and what's going on. And the explanation of nirvana, again, many similarities and also some differences. And then that leads us with chapter 11, which is where we're going to begin this year. Okay, talking about here the Four Immeasurables, because the Four Immeasurables, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Meditation on them are the basis for cultivating bodhicitta. And the Four Immeasurables are also, they're objects on which you can develop serenity. So both in the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition, they say actually fully understanding the Four Immeasurables involves having serenity placed on them. Yeah, not just the quick recitation of them that we do at the beginning of our sadhanas. Okay, so this is where we'll start. They're called Four Immeasurables in the Sanskrit tradition. In the Pali tradition, this is just a translation matter, but they're often called the Four Boundless Ones. Boundless, immeasurable. In other words, they reach out to a boundless number of sentient beings. They have a boundless or immeasurable amount of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Yeah, they boundlessly or immeasurably expand our mind. They're also called the Four Brahma Viharas because developing concentration on them can result in rebirth in the realm of Brahma. So Brahma Vihara is like an abiding place. Sometimes they call monasteries viharas. So you can get born in Brahma's realm. But as practitioners who are aiming for full awakening, we don't want to do that. Yeah, because you get born in Brahma's realm and it's blissful and it's great. And then when the karma for the rebirth there is over, then kerplunk back into the desire realm, and which is the realm we live in right now. And you're not free of cyclic existence. Okay, so it starts on page 207. So we'll do the same way as before. I'll read and then stop and make comments as we read. And since these sections are so rich for meditation, I really encourage you to, especially during the course, we have meditation periods, and also during your free time to do some meditation on these. Okay, so the four, before I start, are there any questions so far with the introduction? Yeah.
So we were talking briefly about the Pali tradition. I don't know if it was related, actually. Something about, was the Buddha omniscient or not? Is that a Pali-held belief?
The most of the people in the Pali tradition say that the Buddha was all-knowing, but he was not omniscient. So the difference between them is omniscient means all the time the Buddha sees all phenomena effortlessly. The Pali tradition says the Buddha can see all phenomena, but he has to turn his mind to them. But once he turns his mind, there's no impediment to seeing them.
Can you speak about that the Sanskrit tradition you said went to Iran and Afghanistan? Can you talk a bit more about what you know in that regard?
Yeah. I mean, Buddhism spread eastward into the Persian area and encountered Alexander the Great's people, I guess. And so you have some statues from that time with very, Alexander the Great was Greek, wasn't he? Yeah. With kind of Greek-looking features. You have some Buddhist statues like that. And, of course, that whole area, the Muslims, Islam spread eastward, so it was overtaken. But from Iran in the early days, then it went north into the area of Central Asia. It crossed over the Karakoram, those mountains, and into Central Asia, to Kashgar and, these very famous cities in Central Asia. And this was mostly by people who were merchants. They were trading, so they became Buddhists in India. They brought Buddhism into those areas. And then, of course, on the Silk Road, so there was a lower Silk Road into China, an upper Silk Road. And Buddhism was very, very rich and widespread there. In Afghanistan, you may remember some years ago, the Taliban exploded these enormous Buddha statues that were carved in the side of the mountain in Bamyan. I was able to see them back in the 70s, quite amazing. And there were caves all in the rock. It was huge, huge statues. And then caves in the side of the mountain where these meditators practiced. And so that whole area, was Buddhist in Afghanistan, then into Central Asia. And so they're still now finding Buddhist scriptures, especially in the Gandhari region, which was in Pakistan. And so a lot of the current Buddhist research involves what they're finding in those areas. Yeah. So now, not many Buddhists, although I did meet one man from, where was he from? Kazakhstan. who was interested in Buddhism in Dharamsala. So,
can you say a little bit about how emptiness as a concept was developed on top of selflessness, and why I guess some Buddhists thought that the concept of selflessness was not sufficient?
Yeah. It wasn't that emptiness was developed on top of selflessness. It was that because you'll see, like in the Tibetan tradition, selflessness and emptiness in many contexts are synonymous. We may talk about different levels of selflessness when we talk about the different tenet schools and what they assert as selflessness, and then in the upper schools what they assert as emptiness. But it wasn't like selflessness is down here and emptiness is higher. Not like that. It's just a different way of arranging the topics. Yeah, but basically in the Pali tradition, the Buddha emphasized, he was always asking people, are the aggregates the self, or the aggregates the possessor of the self, and so really looking to see if there was some kind of permanent, partless, independent Atman that existed, as most of the other people in India at that time believed in, or some kind of self-sufficient, substantially existent person, to test if that existed. And then what Nagarjuna did is he just took those same things that the Buddha said and interpreted them. Well, I can't say interpret. Flesh them out in a different way, explain them in a different way to indicate, talking about not just negating, saying that there was no Atman or no permanent soul, but also talking about the nature of phenomena in general, including the aggregates. Yeah, so his work was really seminal in that way. But you can see how it was based on a lot of what was said in the Pali Suttas. Well, I can't really say in the Pali Suttas because there were 18 schools at that time. And so the schools were not Pali and not Sanskrit, they were just 18 schools. Some probably had their scriptures in Prakrit and who knows what kind of languages. So he probably read those same sutras, not from the Pali, because actually even in Sri Lanka, they didn't use Pali so much as their canonical language until the time of Buddhaghosa, which was 5th century CE. Okay, so so it's not that selflessness was insufficient and something new was developed. Not like that. It was more that Nagarjuna, with his incredible intellect, was able to see a deeper meaning in what the Buddha said and then really expanded that. Okay, but if you read the Pali Suttas with, some of them, there's one where they're talking about one disciple asked the Buddha, is our dukkha caused by self, by others, by both, or causelessly? This is, the verse that Nagarjuna started off his famous, fundamental treatise on the middle way, talking about. Yeah, that verse is quoted, all over the place. But the same negation is right there in what became the Pali Sutras, but were also the sutras taught in northern India, that were not in the Pali language during the same time. Yeah, is that clear? Because when Buddhism went south to Sri Lanka, they developed their own Buddhism, and then they later, brought about use Pali as their canonical language. But at the same time, they were developing all across northern India. There were, and central India and so on, there were other of the 18 Buddhist schools.
Maybe in the past years you mentioned it once, but I never really understood this Brahma world. So how does it come that somebody goes into this world? And later on in the book, maybe you will mention that, but if you do not penetrate it further, the practice of loving kindness, then you will end up in this world. So how do you penetrate it further? I hope you will talk about it. I don't know.
Yeah, this is the different stages of developing concentration. Yeah, so that will come more in the Friday evening class. Yeah, but basically, we want to develop serenity. It's a stage of concentration that gives our mind tremendous flexibility and pliancy to be able to focus on an object of meditation without getting distracted. But that is not the only level of concentration. Then you have the 4 dhyanas or jhanas of the form realm, and then on top of that, the 4 meditative absorptions of the formless realm. And so as you go up, each one of these gets deeper and deeper and deeper, okay, to the point where in the form realm, which are the lower levels of concentration. The beings are sometimes in meditation, but they also, talk to each other and have other things going on. In the formless realm absorptions, they don't even have a coarse body, and they're in meditation the entire lifetime. Yeah, so there's no kind of relationship with other living beings. It's just dwelling completely in their meditative states. Yeah, so developing these levels of meditation, of course, somebody who wants to become a Buddha will develop all of them because they have to know all of them. But to attain arhatship, it's not necessary to develop all of them, but we certainly need some strong concentration in order to meditate on selflessness and emptiness. And to develop bodhicitta, yeah, because if you, develop some feeling of bodhicitta, but then your mind gets distracted, yeah, so concentration is needed to apply to all the other levels of the path, but concentration itself is not a Buddhist practice, it's practiced by other spiritual traditions as well. So in saying that the completion of the Four Immeasurables was developing serenity on them, that's the way it's seen, as completing them. That doesn't mean that anything less than that is insufficient. Okay? Yeah. So we have to get used to this thing. They always give us the thing to aim for. And being goal-oriented Westerners, we always say, oh, that thing to aim for is so high and I'm nowhere near that. I'm like way down here, so it's kind of helpless. And everything I do doesn't come anywhere near that. That's the wrong way of thinking. They show us where to aim for so that we know where we're going. Because if we don't know what the aim is, what the realization we want to develop is, then we don't know what to practice and how to guide our mind, and we don't understand the teachings that we're receiving and how they train us to attain that. So we should look at it as, there it is, and now we have the fortune to be able to receive the training and the teachings and to practice it at our own level, slowly, and to go up and to rejoice at everything we're doing, and eventually we'll get there. Yeah, it would be to not teach the aims of the different qualities we're trying to develop would be like, you have a little kid and you don't tell them about high school or college or even middle school, because they might get discouraged because they aren't there yet. That would really be rather foolish, huh? So, yeah, little kids, they know, you grow up, you go to middle school, you go to high school, you go to college, if you want to, and then you do this and that, so that they have an idea of a path of where they can go and what they can do with different levels of education and so on. Yeah, but you always practice at the level that you're at. Yeah. And don't say, well, I'm 5 years old, but I don't understand calculus yet. I'm a failure. Okay, the four immeasurables, or boundless states, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, are widely taught and practiced in both the Pali and Sanskrit traditions. I wanted to tell you a story here, because one of the misconceptions that is prominent in Sanskrit tradition circles is that the Pali tradition people are selfish. Okay, they only care about themselves and their own liberation. They don't have any love and compassion. And so once, it must have been 1993 or 94, His Holiness was teaching in Arizona, and in the evening program they had some Western teachers teaching, and so Sharon Salzberg was there, and she gave a talk about the Four Immeasurables in the Pali tradition. And Alex Berzin, we're good friends, and he said to me the next day, wow, I didn't know they had those kind of meditations in that tradition. Because that's the level of misconceptions that exist. So to find out, yeah, they're there in all traditions. Okay. Yeah. Then I should tell you one of the misconceptions that Pali tradition and Chinese tradition people often think about the Tibetans is that they think that they all are drinking and having sex and have all sorts of magical powers, such that when I lived in Singapore, sometimes people would come up to me and say, what is my lucky number so I can win the lottery? Sorry, I can't help you. This is not what, we do in Tibetan practice, And one time in where was I? Hong Kong, some man offered Sanghadana, and then in the middle he said, and do you practice Tantra? And, tell me about your Tantra practice. And it's like, I could see what he was getting at. And it's like, no, please take me back where I live. So there's all these kinds of misconceptions. Yeah, that's one of the reasons for writing this book. So these are called immeasurable because they are directed towards immeasurable sentient beings with a mind free from partiality, and because they are states of jhana. Jhana means is the Pali term for dhyana, and it refers to the four form absorptions, not the formless ones. They are states of jhana that are not limited by the five hindrances of the desire realm mind. They are also called the Brahma Viharas, after the Brahma worlds of the first jhana, where beings' minds are gentle. Brahma also implies pure, for that's where the term brahmacharya comes from, which often refers to celibacy. They talk about the Vinaya. So Brahma also implies pure, for these four are free from attachment, anger, and apathy. They are called viharas, or abodes, because they are peaceful resting places for our mind. To come back to your question before about what I said about spheres of consciousness, is when you're meditating, we're desire realm beings as human beings. So our body, right now, our body and mind are desire realm. let's say you do retreat and you get very deep meditation and you attain the first jhana or second jhana or third or fourth, you still have a human body. Your body is desire realm, but your mental state when you're meditating is the same as a being who is born in one of those realms. So your mind is in the plane of existence of one of the jhanas. Or if you develop the formless realm absorptions, you can still have a desire realm body, that's your realm, but your mind can be in the formless realm, have attained that level of concentration. Okay. And that is how or why someone who develops those deep states of concentration in this life but doesn't have renunciation of samsara, that's how they get born in the form and formless realms in the next life. Yeah, because they develop those levels now, but they aren't seeking freedom from all of samsara, so they don't develop wisdom. So because of craving and clinging at the time of death, then they get reborn in those realms, okay, which are called the upper realms. Okay, so now to talk about the Pali tradition. So the Four Immeasurables are spoken of in many Pali sutras, and in the Visuddhimagga, and the Visuddhimagga devotes a full chapter to this practice. The Visuddhimagga is the Path of Purification. It's a very famous text written by the Pali sage Buddhaghosa, 5th century. It's like this, and it's a real encyclopedia of their training. The Metta Sutra, which is in the Sutta Nipata, speaks of immeasurable love and is one of the most popular and oft recited suttas. While meditation on the Four Immeasurables can lead to rebirth in a material realm, at that time I was translating it as material realm. Now I'm going back to form realm. Okay. The further aim of this meditation is to attain a pliable, concentrated mind, a liberation of mind that can be used as a basis for insight into the three characteristics. Okay. When we take the Mahayana precepts, we say a mind, a mind properly liberated, a wisdom properly liberated. So that's referring to liberation of mind and liberation of wisdom. So that's this thing here, a liberation of mind, which means, very deep states of concentration. So you can actually, the ceremony for taking the 8 Mahayana precepts is very similar to the one in the Pali tradition for taking the 8 precepts. It just has a few, different things, but much of it is the same. Okay, so then you use that concentrated mind to, then you shift your object of meditation to the 3 characteristics of impermanence, dukkha, and selflessness, or no self, actually. One way to practice the Four Immeasurables enriches our relationships with others. Okay, so there's many ways to practice the Four Immeasurables. This is one. Love has the aspect of friendliness towards sentient beings and wishes them to be well and happy. This should be our basic attitude toward living beings. Okay, so this what he's describing now is really talking about a very practical, down-to-earth way of seeing how these 4 relate. So here, love, means friendliness, and they're saying that should be our attitude whenever we see any living being. Yeah, so that involves some mental training, because some of us have habits that whenever we see another living being, there's some suspicion. Or there's some feeling, are they going to hurt me or are they going to help me? Or some people, their initial contact with people is, what can I get out of them? What can they do for me? So we have all sorts of habitual MOs, I guess you could say, of what our first way to interact with other beings are. And this colors our relationships with people a whole lot, So here, they're saying to train our mind so that love, meaning friendliness, is that initial response. It's not superstition. It's not suspicion. It's not feeling of threat. It's not what I can get out of somebody. It's friendliness. Yeah. So it's nice to imagine, what would your life be like? Yeah. Okay, if every morning when you came to the stand-up meeting, your mind was in a state of friendliness towards everybody. Or every time, we had a huge group of people come up here for SDD, it wasn't like, got to get the tables and, got to arrange this and that, but a mind of friendliness. Or whenever you went into town and there was, somebody with different political opinions than you have, your mind responded, with a state of friendliness towards that person. Okay? That would just the first one would really change our lives a lot, wouldn't it? Okay, so this should be the basic attitude towards living beings. So we cultivate this. It isn't that we tell ourselves, I should have this. It's we cultivate this, by seeing others' kindness, and by counteracting the suspicion and the self-centeredness that prevents us from seeing other living beings in this way. When seeing sentient beings suffering, we respond with compassion, thus abandoning fear and disgust, and do what we can to be of assistance. So when we see people suffering, instead of running the other direction because it's too scary, we're able to stay and be of benefit to that person. So when people are in the hospital and they're sick, we go to visit them. We don't shy away because it's scary to see people who are sick or people who are approaching death. But we're able to really go and be with these people and offer compassion and connection to them. When we witness their happiness, success, virtue, and good qualities, our response is joy, the opposite of jealousy. Okay? So initial response to sentient beings is love. When we see them suffering, we respond with compassion. When we see them successful, we respond with joy. How wonderful they have this opportunity. How wonderful they got to do this. This kind of joy totally frees our mind from the pain of jealousy. Okay, so again, we have to train our mind in it. When our aim for others' welfare is not accomplished, or others are not receptive to our help, we remain balanced and equanimous. So sometimes, we may be trying to benefit others. They aren't receptive. They don't want to hear. Usually we get frustrated and angry at them. But here, the response is just to stay equanimous, to stay with an equal mind and leave the door open so that as circumstances change in the future, we can reestablish a relationship with them. Okay? So this paragraph has a lot to practice in it. Okay, the following bit unpacks it a bit more, but we're at 10:30 already, so I wanted to stop. We'll get into this in the afternoon. Okay, but just think about this a little bit. And how nice it would be. You go out the door you see the workmen at Prajna house, and your first reaction is friendliness instead of why isn't more done. I'm talking about myself here. Okay.